For nearly 2 decades, James Whitey Bulger operated as one of the most powerful criminals in New England while serving as a protected informant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. During that period, federal agents warned him about arrests, exposed witnesses, blocked investigations, and allowed a criminal organization to function without interference while murders accumulated. This story examined how a federal law enforcement system designed to dismantle organized crime instead became operational support for it. Bulger did not hide from the Bureau, and he did not corrupt it through force or threat. He leveraged its incentives, its priorities, and its fear of failure. Each decision to protect him was justified as temporary, tactical, and necessary. Yet those decisions accumulated into a permanent operating condition. Between the 1970s and the 1990s, at least 19 people were killed by Bulger's organization while he remained under federal protection. The Bureau knew Bulger continued committing serious crimes, but removing him as an informant would have required admitting that the system had failed years earlier. By the time federal authorities attempted to act, Bulger had already been warned and had already disappeared. What followed was not a failure to catch a criminal, but the exposure of a law enforcement system that had reversed its own purpose. This was not a story about a gangster outsmarting the FBI. It was a story about how the FBI allowed itself to be managed by one. The Bureau classified informants by value, creating tiers that dictated oversight and accountability. Bulger occupied the highest echelon, which insulated him from standard review. All decisions regarding enforcement were filtered through this asset hierarchy, allowing selective inaction to appear procedural. Performance metrics incentivized the Bureau to retain Bulger, even as evidence of murders and extortion accumulated. Internal protocols treated every warning as a tactical choice rather than a legal obligation. Bulger exploited jurisdictional divisions, knowing local, state, and federal offices operated without consolidated oversight. Each layer of bureaucracy created friction that delayed or cancelled enforcement. The asset model became self-reinforcing. Continued criminal activity generated more intelligence, which justified further protection. By the late 1980s, the system operated on precedent, not oversight, establishing a de facto immunity for Bulger. The network of informant management, performance metrics, and jurisdictional gaps created an architecture Bulger could exploit systematically. This architecture made it impossible to intervene without admitting the system itself had failed years earlier. Bulger's protection depended on selective reporting, allowing him to manipulate what the Bureau received. Each piece of intelligence filtered upward reinforced his position rather than threatened it. Warnings of pending indictments were transmitted, yet enforcement never materialized. Each delay became a signal, allowing Bulger to act preemptively. Internal investigations into misconduct were subordinated to operational priorities, leaving agents' actions largely unexamined. Jurisdictional ambiguity amplified Bulger's advantage, as state and federal offices failed to consolidate intelligence. By the late 1980s, Bulger's influence extended into policy execution. Operational plans accommodated his movements, and internal enforcement was rerouted to avoid interference. The system no longer contained the asset contained the system. Intervention would have required an admission that protection had replaced prosecution. The violence followed a routine, not emotion, and each killing occurred after a quiet internal assessment of risk. When someone became a liability, the decision was finalized quickly and executed without deviation. The results surfaced later, detached from the process that produced it. At the same time, federal handlers continued regular contact, treating intelligence delivery as proof of control. The absence of confrontation signaled permission rather than ignorance. Witnesses who threatened exposure were identified early, often through information that should not have traveled. Those witnesses never reached a courtroom. Each successful act of intimidation stabilized Bulger's organization and reduced internal risk. The pattern repeated because it worked. Families of victims searched for answers without realizing federal protection existed above local investigations. The system absorbed their questions without reacting. Internally, acknowledgement of the violence circulated without consequence. Stopping the violence would have required confronting the protection that enabled it. By the early 1990s, murder had become a manageable variable rather than a disqualifying event. The violence continued because the system had already decided it was acceptable. By 1994, the protection had reached a point where enforcement could no longer be postponed without visibility. Indictments were finalized, warrants were prepared, and the system began moving toward an arrest that could not be delayed again. That window closed the moment the information moved internally. Before agents arrived to execute the warrants, a warning reached Bulger through unofficial channels. It was not recorded, and it was not denied. When law enforcement arrived, the environment had already changed. The disappearance triggered immediate internal concern, not about escape, but about exposure. The question shifted from where Bulger went to how he knew to leave. Public explanations focused on evasion, while internal records reflected procedural breakdown. Bulger remained absent while the Bureau initiated a manhunt it had already undermined. His disappearance lasted years, sustained by the same failures that had protected him. Internally, the informant relationship became the central liability. Civil lawsuits began exposing what internal reviews avoided. Families of victims forced records into public view. Settlements followed, not as admissions, but as containment. By the time Bulger was finally captured years later, the system that protected him had already collapsed under its own weight. The arrest addressed the criminal, but not the mechanism that enabled him. The warning that allowed Bulger to escape marked the moment denial became impossible. After 16 years in hiding, Bulger was located living quietly under an assumed identity, far from the territory he once controlled. The arrest occurred without resistance, ending a search that had persisted longer than many of the cases connected to him. The capture closed the manhunt, but reopened questions the Bureau had deferred. The trial that followed focused on violence, extortion, and racketeering rather than the protection that enabled them. Evidence was presented sequentially, each act standing alone inside the courtroom. Testimony revealed operational detail, but stopped short of full institutional accounting. Conviction followed quickly, resulting in multiple life sentences. The verdict concluded the legal process without resolving the broader failure. Bulger entered federal custody as the focus shifted away from accountability. Within hours of his transfer to a new facility, Bulger was killed by other inmates. The death occurred before any institutional reckoning could take place. The death eliminated a witness to the system that had protected him. Civil settlements concluded what criminal courts did not address. Financial compensation replaced formal acknowledgement. Internally, policies changed without attribution. The story ended without a final accounting, leaving the mechanism intact despite exposure. The criminal was removed, but the architecture that enabled him persisted. What remained was not a closed case, but a documented sequence of decisions that no one formally owned. After the trial and the death, daily operations resumed across federal offices without interruption. The case receded from active discussion and returned to archival status. No single moment marked the end. Activity simply shifted elsewhere. Revised informant policies circulated quietly, integrated into training without reference to origin. The changes addressed oversight without revisiting cause. Handlers continued meeting with assets under the same framework, now reinforced by procedural safeguards. Oversight reviews concluded without individual findings. Accountability diffused across departments and timelines. Settlements closed remaining civil actions, removing further pressure for disclosure. Public attention shifted as new cases replaced old ones. The narrative compressed into a simplified conclusion. Internally, the sequence remained documented but unexamined. The system did not deny what happened, it absorbed it. The structure remained intact, adjusted but unbroken. What ended was a man, not a method. The sequence remained preserved as documentation rather than reckoning. No formal endpoint marked resolution. The system survived because it never stopped itself.